This is Charlie Hartman again, inviting you to another segment of Grace in the Wilderness. This is our fourth time together. In segment 4, we will focus on Dr. Nathaniel Taylor's explanation of why this initial period of the congregation's experience might be understood as an experiment with more than local implications. We move from the mystery of how John Miles arrived to the stir which he began, the indication of the ferment of early Baptist development. Miles moved from the intolerance of the pre-Civil War England through the toleration under Cromwell's regime, only to be finally ejected from England after the restoration to the throne of Charles II. Miles' apparent hope to create a balanced arrangement between Puritan orthodoxy in which the government, the magistracy, enforced religious behaviors, and a more open latitudinarian approach in which matters of practice could be reviewed and changed. At question here are the relationships of church and state, of conformity or tolerance. In this statement from the 1663 Organizing Covenant, the tension is created. So we are ready to accept and receive too and hold communion with all, such as by a judgment of charity we conceive to be fellow members with us in our head Jesus Christ, though differing from us in such controversial points as are not absolutely and essentially necessary to salvation. With this assertion, Miles placed two critical practices in the category of not absolutely and essentially necessary to salvation. The first had to do with baptism, to be performed by the church only after proof of regeneration that satisfied the entire congregation. The second had to do with who was allowed to partake of communion, or the Lord's Supper. Close communion, only those within their own congregation, or those from any of the other Christian congregations. At stake was the very inclusivity of the church. Let's listen to Dr. Taylor.
Well, the context of the experiment has to be considered in terms of not just the town and the people of the town of Rehoboth, who were the locals, but also the bigger context of the Plymouth colony, because it really was something of a compromise and an experiment on the part of the Plymouth colonial government, who I think we should assume at least understood themselves to be representing a kind of orthodoxy, the orthodoxy that had developed in Plymouth and was essentially by that time the same orthodoxy shared with Massachusetts Bay and all of New England, in allowing Reverend Miles and his friends and supporters to erect a new town under the same footing as all the other towns in the colony, and in allowing that town to have a preacher whom they had already censured. They had recognized his heterodox views. They were, just by that act, endorsing an experiment, allowing the colony to be or to become something that consisted of more than just one form of orthodoxy, more than just one form of worship. But multiplying the same form of local government, of community, but also letting that form of community outside their circle of religious conformity. And I think that showed a certain amount of, a certain aspect of a liberal attitude, a faith in their form of common life and common government, and something of a recognition that they saw that the propagation of that model was more important than the enforcement of a conformity to their, how they defined their precise orthodoxy. So this town, Swansea, was then created to allow this change, this difference of views. So that was an experiment. I think there was recognition, there was likely recognition in Plymouth that the folks erecting Swansea didn't agree with themselves, one another, but the Plymouth folks accepted the intent of the Swansea people, of Willett and Brown and Miles and the others, to act together as a group of men and families, women and children ultimately, who didn't necessarily share the same views on the issues that separated those of Baptist persuasion from the others, but were willing to work together and to worship together. And I see that as a significant issue. I think that's something that probably would have been an easier decision for the men in Plymouth to come to than for the men in Boston at the time.
But the delicately balanced experiment that John Miles began was subject to all the emergencies and dynamics of early colonial experience and development. The King Philip War disrupted the community for 7 years after 1675, when the town began to redevelop and commerce expanded to the south. More people began to arrive. And then in 1683, John Miles died. After seeking help to replace him from their sister congregation in Boston, the congregation elected Samuel Luther to a position of elder. He was subsequently accepted by the town as the settled minister. His tenure was, at first, one of progress and growth, and then one of controversy, which came to a head in 1711. In our next segment, we will look at the second pastor of the Swansea Baptists and the resolutions which moved some back to Congregationalism and some of them away from the experiment to a Baptist establishment. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you for segment 5.